Hello everyone, Tom with Capo Fetish. Today on the channel, we're going to talk about highly acclaimed albums from the 60s that did not chart in the US. I'm going to start off here with an album that's not only a highly acclaimed album from the 60s, it's a highly acclaimed album of all time. I think for the most part, it's always featured in like all-time top 10 lists of critics raving and foaming at the mouth about this particular album. I'm talking about Astral Weeks by Van Morrison from 1968. I love this album, but I always thought that Moondance was a much stronger album. I mean, it's definitely more accessible, it's more commercial sounding, but I have to be in a certain mood to listen to this album. I mean, I understand the brilliance of this album, the free-form poetry, the kind of pseudo-jazz thing going on in here. I love the tracks like Young Lovers Do, first track on side 2, and there's an incredible version by Jeff Buckley. He did this EP called Live at Cine, and he does this absolutely smoking version of Young Lovers Do. You should pull it up online, or even just get the CD. I think it was an EP initially, and then they made it into like a super deluxe with the entire set that he played at Cine. But Young Lovers Do is a favorite. I love Madame George. I've always thought those lyrics were really odd and interesting. Ballerina, Slim Slow Slider, all on side 2. I think I like side 2 better than side 1. I do like Sweet Thing. I mean, I love the whole album. It's not like an all-time favorite, but again, I thought he put out even better albums in the 70s, like of course Moondance and St. Dominic's Preview, albums like that. But again, highly acclaimed album from 1968, one of the most highly acclaimed albums of all time. Did not even reach the top 200, but now it's regarded as one of the greatest albums of all time. Astral Weeks by Van Morrison. Here's a debut from this band, and this band, this is the only album by this band that never reached the top 200 on the Billboard charts, and this album came out in 1965. It's their debut, highly acclaimed. The Who, My Generation. Even the single, My Generation, reached like the lower regions of the top 100 charts on the Billboard charts in the US. I think it was like, it hit like number 80 or 90 or something like that. And it's amazing when you think about the influence and the iconicness of My Generation, how it didn't really do a whole lot at first here in the US, yet today it's still played all the time on classic rock radio. So what you have on here is a couple of tunes that I really liked right off the bat when I bought Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy, their compilation for 71. Those tracks are The Kids Are All Right. Love that track. It has a very Beatless kind of melody. I always loved Illegal Matter, another tune that was on Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy, sung by Pete Townsend. Some of these deep cuts on here I love, like The Good's Gone. Featured some really cool vocals from Daltrey, like early Daltrey is fantastic, right? Much Too Much, The Ox is great. It's Not True, another great track with those classic early Who harmonies, which they're kind of emulating the Beach Boys in these early Who albums, and it sounds fantastic. I love the way Daltrey, Townsend, and Entwistle blend together. It's just fantastic on these early Who albums. They kind of lost that in the 70s. They didn't use those harmonies as much for some reason, but The Who, My Generation from 1966, the US version, did not grace the top 200. It's one of my favorite Who albums, but I think they even got better throughout the 60s with the next album, Happy Jack, a quick one, and of course, The Who Sellout, which is my favorite. So, My Generation by The Who. Another fantastic debut album from 1967 that did not grace the top 200 is Captain Beefheart's Safe as Milk. I've only been into this album for about 10 years. Heard about it for years, finally picked it up, and it's fantastic. Now, I picked out Trout Mask Replica. As many people, I couldn't get into it. So I thought I'd take a chance on this. This is definitely more accessible. There's definitely some avant-garde leadings going on in this album, but there's also some really like left turns on this album that I really dig. This one track called I'm Glad, which really reminds me of something maybe like Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions would do in the early 60s. Like the harmonies on that track are really, really incredible. It really has that early 60s R&B feel to it. And my favorite track on here is definitely that last track. where is it? Where is that track? I want to make sure it is Autumn's Child. Autumn's Child is just it's just really really an amazing track. There's this really subtle guitar part playing throughout the verses, and it's very understated, but I just love hearing that after the like lines are sung. It kind of follows the vocal line. Autumn's Child is fantastic. Zigzag Wanderer, or yeah, that's really cool. Just so many freaking great tracks on here. Zigzag Wanderer, Dropout Boogie, I'm Glad. Electricity is a really freaky track. So yeah, this is a fantastic album. One that I play quite frequently these days. Didn't grace the top 200. They had been planned to be showcased at the Monterey Pop Festival, but they pulled out at the last minute. There was some kind of dispute, some kind of argument going on. I think Captain Beefheart had a meltdown a few days prior at this other festival called the Magic Fair up north in LA, or in California, Northern California. Something happened there. If you know the story, let me know. They were supposed to play the Monterey Pop, but I think there was some kind of dispute with Ry Cooder. I don't know what the deal happened, but great album. Safe as Milk from 1967 from Captain Beefheart. This band put out 3 fantastic records in 1969, along with Creedence. Creedence Clearwater Revival did the same thing. I'm talking about Fairport Convention. They put out Unhalf Bricking, What We Did on Our Holidays, and this, their crowning achievement, Liege and Leaf from 1969. This has been called one of the greatest British rock folk albums of all time. This is the last album that Sandy Denny would be on in their initial run of albums. Every track on here is just life-affirming, and her voice is gorgeous. The first track, Come All Ye, is just really jubilant and uplifting. You got Matty Groves following that track on side 1. And then you've got this track called Farewell on side 1, which is just gorgeous and beautiful. One of the great tracks on here is Tam Lin on side 2, and then Crazy Man Michael. This is an absolute like seamless, flawless album here by Fairport Convention. Never graced the top 200. From 1969, Fairport Convention's Liege and Leaf, and then 2 years later she would go on to perform on The Battle of Evermore by Led Zeppelin on their 4th album, Sandy Denny. What a talent. Another one from 1968, I just got into this in the past 3-5 years or so, is SF Sorrow by The Pretty Things. This is an amazing record. For years, I kept reading reviews about this. I kept seeing videos on YouTube and people exclaiming and praising this album. I finally pulled the trigger, and I'm really glad I did, because I think it's just a really amazing listen. I think it's one of the best psychedelic albums I've ever heard. Some of my favorites on here: Bracelets of Fingers, Barren Saturday, Balloon Burning, Loneliest Person ends the album. Really, really cool way to end the album. The bonus cuts on here are fabulous. Defecting Gray, Mr. Evasion has this weird background, or like kind of a backward vocal whispered kind of thing going on in the chorus. Talking About the Good Times is really creepy fun, and then Walking Through My Dreams is really kind of sunshiny sounding. But yeah, I mean, just kind of a dark album, but there's something very uplifting about it. So SF Sorrow by The Pretty Things from 1968 never really graced the top 200. And now it's getting all of this attention and praise, which it deserves. So SF Sorrow, The Pretty Things from 1968. Here's a singer-songwriter that should have been huge, but I think drug addiction got in the way, mental issues. He passed away in 1980. His first 2 albums are absolutely seamless. They're highly acclaimed. This is my favorite of the first 2 albums of his, Tim Hardin 2. This is just an amazing singer-songwriter album from 1967. His first album is good as well. I would check that out, Tim Hardin 1. I'm holding this up because this is a personal favorite of mine. There's songs on here that other people covered, like If I Were a Carpenter. I think maybe Bobby Darin may have covered that at some point. Correct me if I'm wrong. Red Balloon's been covered by the Small Faces. I love his versions, Tim Hardin's. Every song on here is just a masterclass in songwriting. He's very unique, Tim Hardin. He has a very unique voice. Black Sheep Boy. My favorite track on here is on side 2, track 2. this track called Speak Like a Child that has these really, really unexpected chord changes, and it's very moving. Really, really amazing album. Tribute to Hank Williams ends the album. I really highly suggest you check this album out if you haven't heard it. Tim Hardin is a really underpraised artist. I think he's finally getting a little bit more attention. I mean, he hit one of his most famous songs was covered by Rod Stewart, Reason to Believe, which is on Tim Hardin 1. Rod Stewart covered that on Every Picture Tells a Story and made a big hit out of it years later, even on that Unplugged album he did. But yeah, Tim Hardin 2, fantastic. From 1967. 1969, another just one-off album here by the former drummer of Jefferson Airplane and the former guitarist and singer-songwriter of Moby Grape. That first Moby Grape album was absolutely fantastic when it came out in 67. It just holds up still so well. His first solo album and only solo album, Skip Spence, his album Or, recorded, I think, in just a couple days' time. He just recently got out of a psychiatric hospital for trying to kill 2 of his band members with an axe. There's too much acid overload here with Skip Spence. I think kind of like a Syd Barrett kind of character. You know what I mean? Had all this talent and it was just completely sidelined by acid and drugs. But he somehow pulled this album off. I think it's one of the most unusual psychedelic albums of all time. He plays all the instruments. That first track, Little Hands, is incredible. I mean, there's some times where some of these tracks feel like they're just going to fall apart. He's playing all the instruments. It's so loose. This is about the most loosest playing you'll ever hear on a rock album. His vocals sound ragged and kind of worn down. He sounds kind of like he's seen better days, but there's something really, really, for me, appealing about this album and for a lot of other listeners as well. Some of the highlights for me in here are like Lawrence of Euphoria. War and Peace is cool. Cripple Creek, Diana, Book of Moses. All these tracks are just really, really unique. And it's a very, very original type of record. Some people don't like it. I dig it. And it's highly acclaimed. It never hit the top 200. In fact, it has been reported that this is the worst selling album in Columbia Records history. But this album was re-released on Sundazed with a lot of bonus tracks back in the early 2000s, late 90s. So if you dig psychedelia, check this out. Skip Spence's album, Or, from 69. This album here is the only album by this legendary band that never reached the top 200. They were at a commercial low at this point in the U.S. in 1968. They were kicked out of the U.S. from 65 to 69. There was a dispute with the American Federal Union's board or something or other. I'm sure there was just bad behavior and bad luck. Kinks had a lot of it in the mid-60s, but they kept chugging along, cranking out amazing albums. This album couldn't have been any more out of time. For 1968, the Village Green Preservation Society released the same day as Electric Ladyland, the White Album, but it didn't go anywhere. It was highly acclaimed upon its release, still is, and ironically, having not even reached the top 200 and selling jack shit back in 68, is now the best-selling Kinks album of all time, which is really mind-blowing. So right after this album came out, Arthur would come out, and finally the Kinks were let back into the U.S., and that's when their whole career in the U.S. started all over again, and they started a cult following with Arthur and live shows throughout the 70s until they became like an arena rock band in the late 70s with low budget and give the people what they want. The Kinks have just the most amazing story, like just a roller coaster ride of a career, ups and downs and ups and downs. And this is probably them at their most uncommercial. Nobody gave a shit about them back then, but now it's like everybody loves this album. I love this album. It's definitely in my top 6, top 7. But I think this only shows like one facet of the Kinks, this kind of mid-60s kind of twee Kinks, which I love, like Something Else, Face to Face, but I think they got even better and better with Arthur and Lola and Muswell Hillbillies and Preservation Act 2. But again, an absolute frigging classic album. And my favorites on here, I love every track on here. It's just one of those albums that just flows perfectly from beginning to end. But my absolute favorite on here is Big Sky. And I think that kind of foreshadows more of these kind of, these voice characterizations that Ray would employ with Arthur and subsequent albums. So I think that was kind of the start of Ray's kind of like chameleon voice was with Big Sky, and it's just an amazing track. Johnny Thunder, Picture Book, Animal Farm, people take pictures of each other, sitting by the riverside, just a masterpiece. Only album by the Kinks that never graced the top 200, but yet the biggest selling album now in 2025, from 1968. I had to throw in a jazz album. There's a lot of amazing, highly acclaimed 5-star jazz albums that were released in the 60s. For me, some of the greatest jazz albums of all time. But I had to throw this one in because it's probably the most acclaimed jazz album of the 60s, and that is A Love Supreme from John Coltrane. And I think it just in the past maybe 5 or 10 years sold 1 million. So it took all that whole time from 1965 to just a few years ago to sell 1 million, along with Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. So probably the two most popular jazz albums, famous jazz albums from that late 50s, 60s period. My favorite part of this entire record is on the last track, Pursuance, Part 4, Psalm. That last 2 minutes where everything is just building up like this just incredible, like orgasmic sounding, just incredible thing going on here. It's just amazing. So A Love Supreme, John Coltrane from 65. Another album, surprisingly, that did not hit the top 200 in the US, but now is regarded as one of the greats of all time. 1969's another album by a band, well, should we say, the only album by this band that never graced the top 200, yet most of their albums barely graced the top 200. This is the only one in their 60s repertoire that didn't grace the top 200. The third Velvet Underground album. Throughout the years, I think, listening to so much of these 4 Velvet Underground albums, I think this one is the one I return to the most. Side 1 is just a perfect side for me. I think this has Lou Reed's most sensitive songwriting, most melodic songwriting. That whole first side, Candy Says, What Goes On, Some Kind of Love, Pale Blue Eyes, and Jesus. It's just a perfect side. The only track I don't really care for is the Murder Mystery. Sometimes I play it, sometimes I don't. But even side 2 is just it has just an array of amazing tracks. Beginning to See the Light, I'm Set Free. And then That's the Story of My Life, and then After Hours, sung by Maureen Tucker, the drummer. So the Velvet Underground, another just highly acclaimed album that never hit the top 200 in the US. And I think at this point, probably my favorite VU album. An album from 1965 that didn't grace the top 200, but it's a highly influential, acclaimed 60s garage album. And that is the Sonics. Here Are the Sonics. This is a reissue, obviously, on CD, released by, I don't even know the record company, Ace Records, I believe it's called. So the song Psycho is probably the most famous track on here. And when you hear that song come out of the speakers, it really is ahead of its time for 1965. I mean, it is just balls to the wall. That speaker is moving when that song comes on, right? The vocal, the instrumentation really foreshadows the punk movement 12 years later. I think that song, Psycho, along with 7 and 7 Is by Love, really foreshadows the punk movement and are probably the most hard-hitting garage rock songs of the mid-60s. So the Sonics, Here Are the Sonics from 1965. Another one that's really surprising to me that never hit the top 200 is because it's so influential and so many people talk about it, especially musicians, is the Blues Breakers album, John Mayall and Eric Clapton from 66. This never graced the top 200, yet very influential to the, the booming blues revival in the 60s. And I think this perhaps is the only album Clapton didn't play on. Let me know if he played on other Blues Breakers albums or John Mayall albums, should I say. I think Mick Taylor took over after Clapton. But another just fantastic record, and another one that did not grace the top 200. John Mayall's Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton. He just died recently, John Mayall. I think it was the end of 2024. He had an incredible career, put out so many albums. It just kept going and going and going. So another one, and then a final one here, folks. This group put out 2 fantastic albums, but this is my favorite. Neither of their first 2 albums hit the top 200. I'm talking about the 13th Floor Elevators, their album Easter Everywhere from 1967. Fantastic record here. I think there's less Electric Jug going on in this album, which I think was too much on the first album for my taste. And there's a little more variety, a little more, just a little bit more going on musically on this album. Songs like Earthquake, Dust, Levitation are fantastic. Their version of It's All Over Now, Baby Blue by Bob Dylan is really cool. There's a ton of bonus cuts on this reissue. So another just highly acclaimed album here, 13th Floor Elevators, Easter Everywhere from 1967. If you have any more highly acclaimed 1960s albums that never hit the charts in the US, throw them in the comments section. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you dig the content across this channel, press subscribe. Costs nothing. I'd appreciate it. And we will see you soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.